with either stopping training or cutting back on training for some reason. So for athletes, that could be during the off-season possibly. For recreational or fitness individuals, it could be taking a holiday, over the summer, a couple of weeks with your family, something like that, where you don't train for those 2 weeks because you're busy doing family stuff. Right? Health benefits will also show detraining, but as I said, mainly they concentrate on the performance stuff. But for example, if you've been working at your aerobic fitness for 6 months or so, and you've got adaptation and improvement in your lipoproteins, your LDL and HDL ratio, right? Then if you take 2 weeks off and do nothing, then your LDLs start to increase. Now, 2 weeks isn't long enough to affect the improvement in the HDL numbers, but it does impact the ratio between the two. So that's worth considering. Is there some way, if you're doing a family holiday, or you're not taking 2 weeks off because you're sick for 2 weeks, is there some activity that you can build in with the family so that you don't see such an impact on your LDLs, okay? The level of the loss in adaptation depends upon how long you have been training and the volume and intensity of that training, all right? The adaptations that we get through training decrease at different times, different rates. Eventually, if I take long enough off, all the adaptations will reverse, right? If I remove the stressor for long enough that causes the adaptation, then eventually we'll go back to where we were before. However, the good news is that that's a very long time. So you've got quite a lot of wiggle room in there for taking some time out or cutting back for a little while. So first of all, we're going to look at what happens with our strength, with our resistance work. All right? So if we've been doing a consistent strength program and we stop for some reason, then over the first several weeks we start to lose strength, but particularly we start to lose power. And we have to go for longer than that to start to see big decreases in strength. All right, so the first thing that really gets hit is power event or power stuff. And that, they think, is because you see a much faster change in the type 2 fibers, so in the diameter of the type 2 fibers, more so than you do with the type 1 fibers. So up to about 6 weeks, the type 1 fibers manage to maintain their size pretty well, which means I don't lose too much strength. Right? But because the type 2 fibers are the speed ones, then my power is impacted. All right? Again, good news is that when you go back to training, the retraining occurs much more quickly than the original training did. So if you have to take time off because of your job or because you're sick or you're injured, then your power training when you come back will improve much faster than it did the first time around. So that's good. Getting older, not so good. The declines in strength and power if I stop my program are much faster as I get older. There's some research that suggests it's faster in women than it is in men. Might be because I think it's likely women's muscle fibers aren't going to be as large as the men's in the first place because of having less testosterone. And so I think that that might be why we see faster declines in women, but I'm not absolutely certain what the reason for that is. The lower the intensity of the training before the break, so if I'm not training really hard, I'm kind of just doing a little bit because I know it's good for me, then the greater the loss in strength across the break. All right? And that's important because when we get to endurance, that result isn't the same. All right? So when we're looking at strength training, the lower the intensity of training, the less strong I was, the greater the loss over the break. Okay? So, again, depends why the break, right? If it's your off season or a holiday, then maybe you don't want to have to worry about losing these performance capabilities over the break, right? So, again, pretty good news on the strength front, because if instead of stopping completely, I just reduce the volume, the amount of work that I'm doing, so I can reduce the number of sets, the number of reps, or the frequency. Instead of going 3 times a week, I could maybe just go once a week. The research shows that you can maintain strength for up to 12 weeks if you maintain the intensity of the workout. So remember, when we're looking at strength training, intensity is the weight that I'm lifting. That's the workload, okay? So if I only have time to train once a week, and I can only do maybe 2 sets instead of 4 or 5 sets, if I lift the same amount of weight, then I've got a very large window where I shouldn't lose much strength, if any at all. Right? So that's pretty good news, especially if you're coaching athletes and you can say to them, okay, I know it's summer, I know you're off season, I know we all want to go play, but if you would just go to the gym 1 day a week, when you come back, pre-season training won't kill you. Right? Pretty impressive, I think. And I think that that would be, right, rather than telling them you've got to work out, because that ain't going to happen, right? Then why not say, okay, could you just do once a week? Right? So that's like if we're on a holiday. You can apply that same rule to in season, because in season you should not be training as hard as you are pre-season, right? But sometimes coaches get a little concerned that if they don't train as hard as they did beforehand, they're going to lose all that work they put in. But again, in season, I can train 1 day a week. If I maintain the amount of weight that I am lifting, then decreases in performance are not seen, especially up to 12 weeks. So if your season is longer than 12 weeks, you might have to do maybe 2 days a week for the second half of or maybe do 2 days the first half before they get too tired, and then drop down to 1 day the second half as they're getting more tired. But it does give you quite a lot of flexibility to work on skills and strategy during season, rather than having to spend a lot of time in the gym, right? With the declines, the research says even up to 30 weeks, you will be significantly less strong than you were before you took the break, but you're likely to still be stronger than you were before you ever started training. So even after 30 weeks, I'm still stronger than I was, right? So that's, I think, really quite useful info to have, because we don't, as we'll see, when we talk about overtraining in a little while, we don't want to be hammering them during the season when we want them to play well, right? Now, if we look at endurance training, there are some similarities, but there's also some significant differences. So again, if I've been doing aerobic training and I stop, then we see a very rapid decrease in VO2 max. Within even a week, there's a decrease. Within 2 weeks, there's a big decrease. So on average, you're going to see a 10% drop over a month for athletes. So that's a pretty big drop. Some of that is due to the fact that as soon as you stop doing the aerobic work, your body composition starts changing a little bit. You might put on a little more body fat, and so that body fat doesn't use oxygen, and so that impacts VO2 max. Right? Now, with the training, with the strength training, the harder you train, the less decrease in strength and power you see. With endurance training, the harder you train, the bigger the drop in performance with a break, which is a bit of a bummer, really. We pull that work in, right? So, highly trained individuals lose more capacity in a shorter amount of time than less trained individuals. Right? So maybe they had a lower capacity, so there was less to drop down. Right? And the drop, so one of the first things that happens is, remember that we see an increase in blood plasma volume with the training. So when we stop training, we see a pretty quick decrease in blood plasma volume. And so the drop in blood volume, total blood volume, means that my stroke volume goes down, which impacts cardiac output, which then impacts oxygen delivery to the muscles. And so it's like a knock-on, like a domino line that knocks on to each other. Okay? One of the things we see, RER we didn't really cover, it's the respiratory quotient, and it's a measure of how much carbohydrate and how much fat you are using in your body. What they see within 3 weeks is that where with the training you had switched, remember our 20-minute crossover? If I train really hard, I can drop that down and switch to using fats a little bit sooner, right? When we stop the training, it doesn't take very long for that to eat back up and we start to use carbohydrate preferentially again, all right? Now that's kind of a positive in that carbohydrate can generate more ATP for less oxygen than fat can. So although it's on the negative list, it's sort of a positive in a way because it helps you maintain performance for a little while. Glycogen stores start to deplete after about 4 weeks. So by 4 weeks, our glycogen stores are going down. And more critically, if you are diabetic in particular, insulin sensitivity starts to decrease. So that benefit, we haven't covered the diabetic population yet, but the benefit that we get in insulin capability to move glucose out of the bloodstream by exercising decreases quite quickly. So that's, you know, a reason for diabetics to really try and do something most days, even if they're on holiday, right? So all these items add up to a decreased aerobic performance, okay? So again, we see though that instead of stopping, if we have an option not to stop completely. So obviously it depends on the reason for stopping. But if we have an option, then we can do a little bit of work, either decrease the volume or decrease the frequency that we go out and do our aerobic work. And if we maintain the intensity, so now we're looking at percentage heart rate max. If I work as hard as I usually work, but I do it for a shorter amount of time, or I don't do it 5 days a week, I do it 2 or 3 days a week, we can maintain aerobic capacity. So I can do significantly less work, but maintain my performance for a period of time, which again I think is very attractive, particularly when you're working with competitive athletes who, I mean, let's face it, need a break at the end of the season. I mean, they work so hard that they really earn a break, but they don't want to come back and be in agony in pre-season, right? You don't want to take the whole summer off. That's not a good plan if you're planning on competing again in the new year. So, up to 15 weeks. So we've got up to 12 weeks or so with the strength, and up to 15 weeks with our aerobic capacity, doing a much reduced amount of work, right? Many less days. However, as long as we maintain that intensity, then we can skive off quite a lot, right? Okay, so I'm going to turn the light off because you can't see anything in here. This model is not in this textbook, it's in a different one, but I like it a lot, so I like to use it. So, the idea of optimizing training is trying to keep your athlete progressing and healthy, right? And not kill them, okay? So this particular model I like because it's very clearly divided up into these 4 zones, these 4 areas, and they're pretty logical to follow, okay? So under training, this first block of time, under training is the kind of training you would do in between competitive seasons or during an active rest period, right? So I don't expect to really see any adaptation going on here. I'm just kind of ticking over a little bit, right? Then we go into the workload, right? Into the training. So block 2 is acute overload. Acute overload is the amount of work it takes to stress your body to the extent necessary to see adaptation and then improve performance, right? So here I'm doing the work. I'm stressing the systems and I'm getting some adaptation done. Block 3 is what these authors called overreaching, okay? Overreaching is a brief period where you deliberately overload the training, right? and you don't give the athlete adequate recovery. So it's a very brief period of time. You deliberately overload the system, and you see the final level of adaptation, and you should see some pretty good improved performance. The trick, though, is the timing. Because the problem is, if you keep doing that, then we hit overtraining. And overtraining is doing exactly what you did in overreaching, but you keep going instead of stopping, right? So overtraining is the point at which, instead of seeing adaptations and improved performance, we start to see decrease in performance and detriments in training. Things start to go wrong, right? So this is a big problem, particularly with competitive athletes, right? Because when the maladaptation starts and things start to go wrong, what's the first thing you do when you have a bad training day? The next time you go to the gym, what are you going to do? Work harder, right? So that's the mindset of most athletes. When I'm here, working harder just makes it worse and worse and worse, right? And in their head, they're like, well, I just have to work harder. I just have to work harder, right? And so we get into this very negative spiral, and they end up getting hurt or sick, okay? A really good predictor for this, if you're the coach, or if you can teach your athletes to look out for this, is my favorite, heart rate, okay? Because if I'm doing the same amount of work I was doing here, my heart rate should be the same. But what happens in overtraining is that for the same workload, your body feels like it has to work harder, and so your heart rate goes up. So when you cross the line and you're overtraining, you start to see an increase in heart rate for a workload you were managing just fine last week. Does that make sense? Right? So this is crucial, right? Understanding this line. The difficulty when you're the coach is that the line is in a different place for every single person. Right? So you can't give everybody the same workout and expect everybody to be okay, because that workout for some of them will push them over the edge, right? Plus, remember what I said earlier in the semester, we're looking at it as a movement concept, but overtraining is related to stress. And stress, your body responds to stress exactly the same way, whether it's training stress, emotional stress, right? So you need some idea of what's going on outside of training in order to manage the stress load. Right? So then we have another concept, which is the typical pattern of expected improvement. All right? So if I do this acute overload and this overreaching, then what I expect to see if I'm measuring performance, all right, so this would be time, and this would be performance. Okay? So if I'm doing these properly, my expected improvement would be something like this over time, right? So I improve, I dip a little bit because I get tired, I improve, I dip a little bit, I improve. But over time, my performance is much higher than it was initially, right? So this is if I'm overreaching, or if I'm doing the acute overload, okay? When we look at overtraining, then what we see is something that looks more like this. Right? And so our performance ends up worse than where we were to start with. Because things are breaking down. Yes, sir.
So like, if you notice somebody overtraining, how do you like get them back? Like distress?
It can be really, really difficult, particularly if they're an athlete. You have to cut back intensity and volume. You may have to stop the training altogether because cutting, depending how far into the overtraining they are, just cutting intensity and volume may not be enough.
What if it's like in the middle of the season though?
Well, if they're in the middle of season and they're overtrained, you did a really crappy job as a coach. What can I say? I mean, that's the only thing you can do once they're into overtraining is cut back the workload. And you may have to cut it all together and put them on rest. The problem with that with athletes is I see it all the time down here. I know how hard LV works them, and I know how much work you do with your coach, and you look through the window and they're down there doing extra work off task, right? That they weren't told to do. So the overtraining isn't always the coach's fault. Sometimes it's the athlete's fault because they're not doing what they were told to do. They decide to do a little bit more. But that little bit more is the bit that pushes them over the line, right? So, you know, it's difficult. As I say, it can take months. I mean, like 3 to 4 months to come back. If you seriously overtrain, it's a long recovery period. So it's well worth looking for the signs, and you know that increased heart rate is an easy one to pick up on. They might complain that they feel like they're working really hard when they're doing the same workload they were doing before. So that perception of fatigue would be another, but athletes aren't good at telling you when they don't feel good because that's a sign of weakness, and we're not good at that. Right? So the heart rate is real, because heart rate does not lie. So, you know, that's the best version, I think, of trying to catch it before it deteriorates, because as I say, it can be months to recover from that. So, if we think about that model, right, those 4 blocks, how do we organize then the training so that we don't get into the overtraining? Okay? And we want to use a technique called periodization. Historically, periodization has been used a lot within a weight room. So weightlifters have used it for a long time. But you can also periodize for endurance athletes, so it's more and more popular now because any little edge you can get makes a big difference. Right? So periodization is the planned variation in training. So I deliberately chunk my training periods to optimize performance over a long time. Okay? So that means that at the beginning of the year, it's important that you sit down and decide, what are my main goals for this season? What are my main competitions? If it's not an Olympic year, and it's not a World Championship year, what am I trying to peak for this year? If it is a World Championship year, can I also peak for nationals as well as worlds? Or do I have to do well enough at nationals to make the World Championship team? Right? So these are all the kinds of questions where it starts to get complicated. A good coach has to do a lot of work. Planning, getting the training programs right. So when we periodize, we've got all our different variables that we can change around and play games with. Right? We've got our training volume, we've got our intensity, we can change up the type of exercise we're doing so that we hit different muscle groups and different contraction patterns. All right? What kind of training are we doing? Can we change that up so that we don't get bored? Okay? And for athletes, we've also got to take into account skill and strategy. So periodization, if it's done properly, will lead to much higher strength gains. Doesn't matter whether you're an athlete or a typical person. If you do it right, then you will see improvements in your strength. And if you're seeing improvements in strength, it's likely that you're seeing some changes in body composition, which is always beneficial, okay? And hopefully improved motor performance. So for resistance work, we're looking at something like this. So this is a classic kind of old-fashioned strength power training plan in a weight room, right? You can adapt it for doing body work resistance or bands or, you know, little dumbbells or something like that, okay? So block 1 is working on size. So each phase is typically between 4 to 6 weeks, depending upon what you're aiming for, okay? So block 1 tends to be the size block, and then we have a recommendation of the kind of work we should be doing if we're looking to put on size, okay? The next 4 to 6 week block is working on our strength, and for the size, we don't want very much weight, we want lots of volume. When we get to our strength, we need some more weight on the bar. Okay. Block 3 is our power. Okay. So now we're working with some speed, if we can. And then we have a peaking block. What they don't put on here that is really important is that either block 3 or block 4, depending upon your cycle, has to be followed by, these are all 4 to 6 weeks, 1 to 2 weeks recovery. Not rest, active recovery. All right? And then, after your active recovery, you cycle back round and you start again. Okay, so in here, for example, you might want to work squats for strength. But squats aren't such a great exercise if what I'm working on is power. So you might switch out the squats for power cleans in the third block. Right? So you can block off the type of exercise to be optimal for the goal for that training period. Okay? The active recovery is really important. It's important physiologically, so that we don't go into overtraining, and it's important psychologically, so that you don't burn out your athlete. Some resources will recommend that you only use this kind of periodization plan for your multi-joint exercises. So you would use it for your squats, but you wouldn't use it for your leg extensions, for example. And then when you repeat the cycle, you increase the intensity, right? It's still lower than this and this, but it's more weight than it was the first time you did that block. Right? If you're really interested in resistance training periodization, the textbook also goes into non-linear periodization, which is a little more variable than this. So there's quite a lot of information, but also the terminology. If you're interested, go look at the kinds of language, because then you can search, you can Google search the language and see if you can find a valid source. Valid source. Okay? Don't go listening to Joe Blow-in Clovis. You can listen to Darylin at SNAP, because he graduated from my program. He knows what he's doing. So as I said, historically, periodization has been used for our weight work, our resistance work, but it's also possible to use the same idea when we're looking at an endurance plan. And when we're looking at an endurance plan, we're often going to build in what we call a taper at the end of the plan when we get close to the competition. So let's say that here is World Championships, right? Week 25, okay? So when we're looking at volume for aerobic work, then we could be looking at the distance that we're going, we could be looking at the intensity that we're working at, right, or our best time for that distance, okay? How much work are we doing? And you can see that over the first few weeks, the volume goes up a little bit each week. And here's my active recovery week, okay? So in this model, active recovery is week 7, okay? Then we do a lot more work, so we build in a quicker recovery week, right? This is all pretty hard, so we're doing our recovery, and then here we're tapering. So tapering means I pull back a little bit so that when they get, remember how much damage we do doing endurance work to the muscle tissue. We've got to give the muscle tissue adequate time to recover and fix all the microtrauma and the damage so that when we hit World Championships week 25, we can run as hard as we can. Okay. So tapering is a planned reduction in the volume of work that you're doing. Sometimes you might also reduce the intensity, but not always. Might depend on the event that you're competing in, all right? And if you're interested in the endurance work and the idea of tapering, there's a very nice box on page 402 that gives a little bit more information about that. The basketball players, there's a really interesting box for you on page 399. So these training periods then, you'll see the terms, when you're looking at periodization, you'll see the terms macro, meso, and micro. So the macro picture may be a 12-week picture, or it may be the whole year, right? The meso is a block of that, so maybe a 4-week period. And then the micro might just be 1 week. So I don't only periodize week to week to week to week, I periodize within the week. So I start out gently and I build up in volume and intensity, or I start out really hard and I make sure that I drop down towards the end of the week so that the next week when I go out hard I've had a rest day. Right? Should never be training 7 days a week. Never be training. That's not being active 7 days a week. That is not exercising 7 days a week. Right? Because day 6 and 7, wherever they are in the week, depending on what you're doing and who you're working with, you might want 1 or 2 days of light work, active recovery, and 5 heavy days, or 6 heavy days and 1 day off, again, depending on who you're working with, right? But the day off isn't sit in front of the TV and watch the football game with 3 bags of chips and a tub of ice cream, right? The day off is, I'm going to take the dog out for a walk and we're going to go around the track twice, right? Or I'm going to take the kids to the pool and we're going to go swimming, right? So the periodization idea has to occur week to week, within the week, as well as looking at the bigger picture. And you want to get it right because you don't want to peak or taper to the wrong point. Right? So quite often you'll see, I'll go back to tennis because I know tennis, quite often in tennis, especially at a Grand Slam, which is a 2-week tournament, someone will play their socks off week 1 and then go away in week 2 because they got it wrong by 1 week. That's all it takes, right? And then I don't win now. Now I'm out of the tournament instead of winning the tournament because I got it wrong by 1 week, right? It's really technical. It's very, very clever stuff. It's hard. I can't do it. I can tell you about it, but I wouldn't be able to do it very well, right? So, you know, being a really good strength and conditioning coach, being a really good skill coach, there's a lot to it. Okay, we're done with chapter 13. Did everybody see the new schedule? Okay. Yes.
So you said that our physical activities portfolio could be due a day before or like where?
Last before, so it's, I think it's moved from the 1st of May to the 29th of April.
Right. Okay, because like you said that, but then on the new schedule,
I might not have written it down.
yeah. Okay.